1890, New York. They called it the Gilded Age, a time when America's wealthiest men built empires on steel and secrets. But the shine was a lie. This is the true story of Thomas Sterling, a tycoon who sold his country for profit, and the reckless heir, Arthur, who paid the ultimate price to expose him. His only chance for justice? Eleanor Vance, a journalist from the tenements. She knew the risk. To save the American dream, she had to shatter the gilded cage and prove that the true foundation of this nation is not wealth, but the unbroken thread of truth. Welcome to the Unbroken Thread. If this kind of storytelling helps you rest, feel free to like the video and subscribe, but only if it actually brings you peace.
The year is 1890, and America is a nation roaring, a colossal engine of progress and unparalleled ambition. New York City in particular pulsates with an almost feverish energy, its skyline pricking the heavens with nascent skyscrapers, monuments to an industrial might that seemed boundless. Yet beneath the shimmering veneer of progress, within the Gilded Age, lay a stark dichotomy. Immense wealth for a privileged few, built upon the straining backs of an ever-growing working class. It was a time of dazzling innovations, electric lights replacing gas lamps, telephones whispering across vast distances, but also of brutal labor practices, teeming tenements, and a pervasive sense that the rules were being rewritten, often to the detriment of the common man. Our story begins in the labyrinthine streets of Lower Manhattan, a world away from the opulent Fifth Avenue mansions where Vanderbilt and Astor held court. Here, amidst the clamor of horse-drawn carts, the guttural cries of street vendors, and the relentless churn of humanity, we meet Eleanor Vance, a young woman whose spirit burned brighter than the flickering gaslight in her family's humble tenement flat. Eleanor, barely 20, possessed a keen intellect and an unyielding sense of justice, qualities often dismissed in a society that valued the woman's domesticity above all else. Her father, a proud but weary Irish immigrant, toiled long hours in one of the city's burgeoning textile mills, his hands calloused, his spirit gradually eroding under the relentless demands of his employers. Her mother, a quiet but resilient woman, managed their meager household with an almost surgical precision, stretching every penny to ensure her children were fed, clothed, and educated, however minimally. Eleanor's days were a monotonous cycle of assisting her mother, caring for her younger siblings, and, most importantly, devouring every scrap of knowledge she could lay her hands on. The public library, a beacon of hope in a city often devoid of it, became her sanctuary. There she would pore over newspapers, historical texts, and the revolutionary ideas of thinkers like Henry George, whose critiques of vast wealth inequality resonated deeply with her observations of New York life. She saw the glittering carriages of the rich pass by her window, ferrying women adorned in silk and jewels, while just blocks away, children her siblings' age starved. The injustice of it all gnawed at her, fueling a quiet determination that would soon propel her far beyond the confines of her expected destiny. Meanwhile, miles uptown, in a world of polished mahogany and hushed servants, lived Arthur Sterling, the scion of one of New York's oldest and most influential industrialist families. Arthur, in his late 20s, was a man burdened by expectation. His father, the formidable Thomas Sterling, had built an empire in railroads and steel, a colossus that spanned the nation. Thomas Sterling believed in social Darwinism, the survival of the fittest, and applied it ruthlessly to his business practices, crushing competitors and squeezing every ounce of labor from his workforce. He saw unions as an affront, philanthropy as weakness, and government regulation as an unnecessary impediment to progress. Yet Arthur was a man of conflicted conscience. Educated at Harvard, he had been exposed to progressive ideas that challenged his father's uncompromising worldview. He understood the elegance of the locomotive, the power of steel, and the transformative potential of industry, but he also saw the human cost. the stories of injured workers, of families evicted from company housing, of political influence peddling, these troubled him deeply. He harbored a secret desire to use his privilege for good, to mend the social fabric his father seemed intent on tearing apart. But the weight of his family's legacy and his father's dominant personality kept him largely silent, a gilded bird in a gilded cage. He spent his days in his father's offices, learning the intricate dance of finance and power, but his nights were often spent in quiet introspection, gazing out at the twinkling lights of the city, wondering if there was another way, a more just path for America's future. The reckless dawn of America thus unfolded with a dazzling spectacle of innovation and growth, but it was a dawn fraught with peril. The chasm between the rich and the poor widened with each passing year, and the inherent tensions within this gilded cage were beginning to strain. The stage was set for collision between those who benefited from the system and those crushed by it, between ideals and harsh realities. Eleanor, with her burgeoning sense of purpose, and Arthur, with his internal struggle, represented two sides of a coin, unknowingly destined to cross paths in a city brimming with both boundless opportunity and profound injustice. Their individual journeys, though seemingly disparate, were threads in the same vast tapestry of a nation grappling with its own identity, its own definition of progress, and the true cost of its audacious, glittering dream. The era was a simmering pot, waiting for the spark that would ignite change, or perhaps chaos. And that spark, as fate would have it, was closer than anyone imagined.
The year 1890 gave way to 1891, and the reckless dawn of the Gilded Age began to show its first cracks. The whispering campaign of progress that promised prosperity for all was increasingly drowned out by the metallic clang of industrial discord. America, though officially at peace, felt the growing tension of class warfare, a struggle waged not with armies, but with lockouts, picket lines, and the immense, crushing power of corporate monopolies. For Eleanor Vance, the urgency of this struggle became personal. Her father's textile mill, owned by a subsidiary of Arthur Sterling's industrial complex, suddenly announced a brutal wage reduction, coupled with an increase in working hours. The official reason was market correction. The unspoken truth was pure greed. The mill workers, already existing on the precipice of starvation, were forced into a desperate gamble, a strike. Eleanor, witnessing the swift, brutal reaction of the company, felt her intellectual curiosity morph into fiery conviction. Thomas Sterling's men, tough, well-paid enforcers hired to intimidate the strikers, patrolled the mill gates. The local police, often on the payroll of the industrialists, turned a blind eye to the harassment. It was here, in the cold, unyielding shadow of the steel mills, that Eleanor found her calling. She began by organizing for the strikers' families, setting up a clandestine system for food and medical aid. More critically, she started writing. Using a pen name, The Watchman, she penned scathing, meticulously researched articles for a small, independent socialist newspaper. Her prose was sharp, dissecting the hypocrisy of the robber barons and exposing the specific, cruel calculations behind the wage cuts. She argued that the great industrial boom was not a sign of a strong nation, but a powder keg, ready to explode under the pressure of neglected humanity. Her article, Steel and Soul, The True Cost of the American Rail, resonated with the growing wave of discontent, turning the local mill strike into a nationally watched symbol of labor exploitation. Eleanor, operating from the shadows of her tenement, felt a dangerous surge of empowerment. She was no longer just observing, she was actively shaping the narrative, whispering truths that the titans of industry desperately wanted suppressed. Meanwhile, Arthur Sterling, now deeply entrenched in his father's vast enterprise, felt the growing heat from the labor disputes.
He was tasked with managing the very strike that was destroying Eleanor's community. His father Thomas saw the strike as a test of Arthur's mettle. "They are malcontents, Arthur," Thomas had boomed one morning over their lavish breakfast, the city's turmoil seeming a million miles away. "A spoiled few trying to dismantle the very system that feeds them. Crush this strike quickly and completely. Show them the weight of sterling steel." Arthur, however, saw the strikers not as malcontents, but as fathers and sons fighting for dignity. He had secretly visited the mill town outskirts, disguised in common clothes, and had been shaken by the raw poverty and despair. He knew the wages were indefensible. His progressive ideals clashed violently with his filial duty and the practical, hard-nosed demands of the business. He proposed a compromise to his father, a modest increase in safety standards and a small bonus system, arguing it would be a strategic move to undercut the union's leadership and project a more benevolent public image. Thomas Sterling's reaction was explosive. "Benevolence is for churches, Arthur. This is business. You give them an inch, they take the factory. We must project power. Fear is cheaper than a pay raise." Arthur realized the depth of his father's cold, absolute control. He became the reluctant executioner of his father's policies, a constant observer of his own moral decay. He authorized the deployment of private security, the very enforcers who intimidated Eleanor's father, and felt the sickening weight of his family's shadow of steel descending over the lives of thousands. The line between being Thomas Sterling's son and the man of conscience blurred, leaving him isolated and deeply conflicted. The whisper of war intensified with a single dramatic event. A key railway bridge, crucial for transporting sterling steel, was sabotaged, a desperate act the company immediately blamed on the striking workers. It was a catalyst for violence. Thomas Sterling used the incident to demand intervention from the state governor, painting the strikers as domestic terrorists. It was this bridge incident that finally brought Eleanor and Arthur into proximity. Eleanor, recognizing the company's likely fabrication, decided to investigate the sabotage herself, using her growing network of contacts among the dock workers and the railmen. Arthur, though publicly maintaining his father's narrative, secretly suspected the sabotage might be an inside job, a false flag operation, designed to break the strike, a tactic his father had hinted at using years ago. He began his own discreet investigation, driven by a deep, unsettling fear that his family had crossed the line from ruthless business to criminal conspiracy. In their separate searches for the truth behind the railway bridge bombing, Eleanor, the tenacious watchman from the tenements, and Arthur, the conflicted heir from the penthouse, began to circle the same dangerous hidden facts. They were both chasing a ghost in the machine of the Gilded Age, uncovering a story that reached far beyond a simple labor dispute, hinting at political corruption and massive wartime profiteering that would soon define America's entry into global conflicts. The shadow of steel, cast by the Sterling Empire, was no longer just an economic force. It was a looming, potentially criminal power, and the quiet whisper of class war was rapidly turning into a public scream for justice. The true danger lay not in the strike itself, but in the truth that both Eleanor and Arthur were independently getting closer to uncovering, a truth that could either bring down the Sterling dynasty or bury them both.
The clandestine alliance formed in the fog of Central Park was an agreement built not on trust, but on mutual, desperate necessity. Eleanor Vance and Arthur Sterling were an unlikely team, the tenement-dwelling firebrand and the gilded heir, united by the shadow of Thomas Sterling's monstrous ambition. Their collaboration became a tightrope walk across the fault lines of American power, where a single misstep meant not just ruin,
but potential death. Arthur's task was the most perilous, operating as an internal spy within the Sterling Empire. His father, the tycoon, was a man whose paranoia was matched only by his ruthlessness. Thomas Sterling had an instinct for betrayal, and Arthur knew he was constantly under surveillance by his father's chief of security, a cold, efficient operator named Harriman. Arthur began by discreetly accessing the company's non-public ledgers, focusing on the suspicious security payout he had noted. He discovered the funds were routed through a shell corporation to a firm of private mercenaries, not merely security guards. More alarmingly, the firm had a history of involvement in covert operations in Latin America, hinting that Thomas Sterling's ambitions extended far beyond American railroads. The fault lines upon which the Sterling fortune was built were not just social, they were also geographical, exploiting global instability for cheap resources and maximum profit. Arthur needed a secure way to pass this fragile evidence to Eleanor. The modern telegraph was too easily intercepted. He relied on an old-world method, encoded messages delivered by a trusted, albeit slightly eccentric messenger, an elderly, impoverished book collector who frequented the public library, where Eleanor spent her days. The messages, hidden within the pages of obscure historical texts, detailed the money trail, the shell companies, and the mercenary firm's involvement. Eleanor, receiving these cryptic fragments, was initially wary. Each piece of information was like a blinding flash, confirming her deepest suspicions about the depth of corporate evil. She used her journalistic contacts, a network of dock workers, union organizers, and sympathetic city clerks, to verify Arthur's data. She traced the Shell Corporation back to a series of backroom deals involving powerful political figures, showing that the bridge sabotage was merely a small piece of a much larger conspiracy to secure lucrative government contracts for sterling steel under the guise of national security. Her investigation revealed the tycoon's true bargain. Thomas Sterling was not just exploiting labor, he was actively lobbying for American military expansionism, hoping that a war, any war, would guarantee massive, continuous orders for his steel and rail, cementing his empire. The bridge sabotage was a calculated move to stoke public fear and justify his political influence. The future of America's youth and resources was being gambled away for one man's profit. The pressure mounted, and with it, suspicion. Harriman, the security chief, noticed Arthur's unusual interest in historical ledgers and his secretive movements. He reported his concerns directly to Thomas Sterling. One evening, Arthur was summoned to his father's magnificent study, a room dominated by a portrait of Commodore Vanderbilt, a stark reminder of the ruthless men Arthur was expected to emulate. "There are whispers, Arthur," Thomas said, his voice dangerously low, not looking up from the stock reports. "Whispers of a Judas in my house. Someone is leaking information to that socialist rag, fueling the watchman's lies." Arthur felt a knot of cold dread. He knew this was the test. He couldn't lie about his movements, but he could redirect the suspicion. "Father," Arthur replied, keeping his voice steady, "I was examining the accounts related to the Blackwater security firm. They are inefficient. Their costs are too high, and they operate without oversight. I suspect they are the source of the leak, trying to extract more funds." He handed his father a meticulously forged report detailing minor financial discrepancies of the security firm, a brilliant piece of misdirection that both showed his loyalty and cast suspicion onto the very entity responsible for the corporate espionage. Thomas Sterling smiled, a predatory curve of his lips. "Good, Arthur. You have a snake's cunning after all. Double their surveillance. If they are stealing from me, they will regret the day they learn to count." Arthur had passed the test, but the psychological toll was immense. He had learned to lie to his own father with the ease of a master manipulator. He realized that to fight the tycoon, he had to become a reflection of his methods. The gilded cage was slowly turning him into the very thing he despised. Eleanor, meanwhile, was preparing to publish her most explosive piece yet, an exposé connecting sterling steel, the bridge sabotage, and the political push for interventionism abroad. This article, War for Profit, the Fault Lines of American Democracy, would name names and provide irrefutable evidence of the conspiracy. She arranged for a final, crucial exchange with Arthur. The complete set of documents, including a direct cable from Thomas Sterling to a senator detailing the war profiteering scheme. The meeting was set for a late-night streetcar depot, a place of constant, anonymous movement. Arthur arrived, concealing the documents in a rolled-up blueprint. He was pale, exhausted, and visibly under immense strain. "This is everything, Eleanor," Arthur whispered, handing her the blueprint. "The cable is the end of him. It shows the whole bargain." "This will change the country, Arthur," Eleanor replied, her hands trembling as she took the roll. Suddenly, the streetcar depot was flooded with movement. 3 men, led by the ruthless Harriman, emerged from the shadows. Arthur's diversion had failed. Harriman had followed the trail of the suspicious book collector and realized the depth of Arthur's betrayal. "Mr. Sterling," Harriman's voice cut through the air, "the tycoon sends his regards and his regret." Arthur knew instantly he was about to be eliminated. He had fulfilled his duty to Eleanor, but his redemption had cost him his life. "Run, Eleanor, now!" Arthur shouted, lunging at Harriman, buying her the precious seconds she needed. Eleanor didn't hesitate. She clutched the blueprint and sprinted into the dark labyrinth of the city streets, the crack of a gunshot echoing behind her. The tycoon's bargain had exacted its first brutal price. The unbroken thread of the American dream had just been stained with blood, and the watchman now carried not only the truth, but the weight of a powerful man's sacrifice. The fight to save America from its own ambition had just begun.
The gunshot echoing through the empty streetcar depot became the terrifying punctuation mark on the end of a fragile alliance and the start of a ruthless chase. Eleanor Vance, clutching the rolled blueprint, the irrefutable proof of Thomas Sterling's corruption, ran as the final surviving link to the truth. She ran with the horrifying image of Arthur Sterling lunging into the darkness, a wealthy scion who had sacrificed everything for a flicker of principle. The city, once Eleanor's battleground, now became her hunter. She knew Thomas Sterling would deploy every resource to silence her and recover the documents, already understanding that the tycoon's reach extended into the highest offices of the police and the city hall. She could not go home. Her family would be in immediate danger. She could not approach her newspaper office. It would be the first place Harriman's men would look. Her only recourse was to disappear into the very demographic that the Sterling Empire sought to crush, the teeming, anonymous immigrant community of Lower Manhattan, the tidal wave of humanity that passed through Ellis Island daily. Eleanor sought refuge in the old Irish neighborhood of the Five Points, a maze of crowded tenements and labyrinthian alleys where 1,000 pairs of eyes saw nothing they didn't want to see. She relied on the network of trust she had built while organizing the mill strike, particularly a family named the O'Malleys, who ran a cramped, legitimate laundry business that served the whole district. Disguised in borrowed, drab clothing, Eleanor became another anonymous face in the crowd. She spent her days hidden away, meticulously reviewing Arthur's documents. The blueprint contained detailed schematics for a massive expansion of Sterling Steel's production capabilities, but it was the attached cable that confirmed everything. Thomas Sterling was guaranteeing a senator substantial kickbacks in exchange for the Senate pushing the U.S. toward military conflict in the Caribbean, a war that would turn Sterling Steel into a trillion-dollar monopoly. The corruption was systemic, a monstrous tycoon's bargain that traded American blood for American gold.
Eleanor realized her task was not just to publish a story, but to expose a conspiracy that threatened the nation's democratic soul. To understand the full scope of Thomas Sterling's global ambition, Eleanor needed information that was only whispered in the new wave of immigrant communities. She found her way to a hidden, unofficial information hub near Ellis Island, a small, bustling Italian cafe run by an old woman who was fluent in 5 languages and whose customers spanned every corner of the globe. This cafe was a temporary resting place for newly arrived immigrants, a place where people traded rumors of old world wars, new world opportunities, and the specific companies offering and exploiting labor. It was here that Eleanor truly witnessed the Ellis Island echoes. She spoke to Polish steelworkers who had been lured with false promises, only to find themselves indebted to the Sterling Corporation. She heard from Cuban refugees whose homes were in the very territory Thomas Sterling wanted the U.S. military to invade. Each story was a sharp piece of glass reflecting Sterling's global network of exploitation. One young man, an Italian socialist named Marco, who had just arrived, became a vital source. He shared how the massive industrial expansion Arthur had documented was being fueled by deliberately misleading advertisements placed in European newspapers, promising immigrants high wages and safe working conditions that simply did not exist. The immigrant tide was rising, not because America was ready for them, but because Thomas Sterling needed their cheap, desperate labor to execute his vast, bloody bargain. Marco and the other immigrants, the O'Malley family, the cafe owner, became Eleanor's new allies, a grassroots army of the disenfranchised. They provided protection, information, and a sense of belonging that she had lost since fleeing her home. She learned that the true strength of America lay not in the skyscrapers Arthur's family had built, but in the resilient, unbroken spirit of the people who worked beneath them. The threat was closing in. Harriman's men were tearing apart the tenements, using brutal tactics to extract information about the girl with the papers. They discovered the old independent newspaper office, shutting it down and arresting the editor. Eleanor was running out of time and options. She realized she couldn't rely on the traditional system, the courts, the police, or even the established press. All were too compromised by the tycoon's influence. To publish the truth, she needed a platform that was beyond the reach of Thomas Sterling's immediate control. Marco suggested a bold, unprecedented move. Use the Immigrant Network's communication system. They would print an emergency single-sheet paper, the Watchman's Call, containing the damning evidence from Arthur's files, and distribute it simultaneously across the immigrant communities of New York, Boston, and Chicago, using the clandestine channels of union organizers and ethnic societies. Eleanor, standing in the noisy, warm chaos of the Ellis Island Cafe, felt the immense weight of Arthur's sacrifice, her family's danger, and the fate of the nation. She had the truth, and the immigrants were her megaphone. She wrote a final personal note on the blueprint before handing it to Marco for printing. "To my countrymen, Arthur Sterling died to give you this truth. Do not let his sacrifice or your struggle for a better life be in vain. The tycoon's bargain ends now." The next morning, as the first ferry from Ellis Island steamed toward Manhattan, carrying thousands of new dreams and new faces, a new kind of echo was ready to be heard. The Watchman's Call, a powerful voice rising from the immigrant tide, an explosive ultimatum that would finally challenge the immense power of the shadow of steel and force America to confront the corrupt fault lines upon which its glittering fortune had been built. The stage was set for a public confrontation that would rock the foundations of the Gilded Age.
The printing of the Watchman's Call, a simple, single-sheet paper distributed silently through the immigrant networks, was a match struck in the heart of the Gilded Age. Its contents, detailing the tycoon's bargain and the role of the late Arthur Sterling as a whistleblower, sent shockwaves through the highest echelons of New York society and the halls of Washington, D.C. The sheer audacity of the anonymous exposé, coupled with the verifiable facts it contained, momentarily paralyzed the political machine.
But paralysis was quickly replaced by rage. Thomas Sterling, a man accustomed to absolute control, saw his empire and his legacy under attack. He realized the fatal error of his own arrogance. He had underestimated his son, and more critically, the resilience of the common people. Harriman, his chief enforcer, reported that Arthur had been dealt with, but that Eleanor Vance, the watchman, had escaped with the documents. The tycoon's focus shifted from recovery to total destruction. While Eleanor remained in hiding, protected by the anonymous crowds of the lower city, the public scandal forced Thomas Sterling's political allies to scatter like mice. The implicated senator, desperate to save his career, feigned outrage and denied any knowledge of the war profiteering scheme. The pressure on Thomas Sterling became immense, and it was in this moment of vulnerability that the roots of his current corruption, the serpent in the garden, began to surface. Eleanor, reading the mainstream newspapers from her hideout, noticed a recurring pattern in Thomas Sterling's defense, a reliance on manipulating public sympathy by emphasizing his humble, self-made beginnings. She knew this was a lie. Her contacts, working through decades-old public records, began digging into Thomas Sterling's past, and what they found was not the tale of a hard-working immigrant success story, but a darker narrative of calculated betrayal. The true scandal had its roots 30 years earlier, during the tumultuous period of the Civil War. Thomas Sterling was not a veteran who returned to build an honest fortune. He was a ruthless profiteer who capitalized on the nation's agony. The documents unearthed by Eleanor's allies revealed that Thomas Sterling had started his career not by building steel, but by supplying shoddy, overpriced iron to the Union Army during a critical period of the war. His iron, meant for crucial railroad tracks, was diluted and structurally unsound. This substandard material led to a catastrophic train derailment carrying Union troops, resulting in a significant loss of life, an event that was officially covered up and blamed on Confederate sabotage. Thomas Sterling used the insurance payout from the disaster to acquire his first major steel mill, literally building his initial fortune on a foundation of betrayal and death. This original sin was the serpent that had long been hidden. The current war profiteering scheme was merely an echo of his past, a pattern of sacrificing human lives for personal gain. The depth of the scandal extended beyond financial fraud. The cover-up of the Civil War derailment involved a former Supreme Court justice whose descendants now sat on the Sterling board, ensuring a gilded silence around the tycoon's true origins. This revelation showed the terrifying permanence of systemic corruption in American history, the same families and institutions across generations working to protect the original wrongdoers. Eleanor realized that to permanently dismantle the Sterling Empire, she could not just expose the bridge sabotage, she had to expose the serpent in the garden, the 30-year-old betrayal that laid the foundation for everything. She needed one final critical piece of evidence: the name of the senator's ancestor who initiated the Civil War cover-up, a name hidden in Thomas Sterling's private vault records. The public clamor had bought Eleanor time, but it had also pushed Thomas Sterling into a corner. He was preparing to flee the country, arranging a private steamer to Europe. The documents needed to be secured now. Eleanor, armed with the new knowledge of the Civil War scandal, formulated a desperate final gambit. She knew Harriman was hunting her, but she also knew Thomas Sterling was now focused on salvaging his personal wealth, not his political allies. Eleanor found the only person left in New York who might still have a fleeting connection to Thomas Sterling's personal life: Arthur's distraught, estranged mother, Elizabeth Sterling, who lived a life of isolation in the gilded cage. Elizabeth, crushed by the realization of her son's probable murder and the monstrous truth of her husband's empire, had finally reached her breaking point. Eleanor, risking everything, slipped a note into Elizabeth's mansion, appealing to her grief and her desire for justice for Arthur. The note didn't threaten, it only contained two facts: the Civil War derailment and Thomas Sterling's role in Arthur's death. A meeting was arranged, another clandestine exchange, this time between the two women who had loved the conflicted Arthur Sterling. In the cold, formal parlor of the Sterling mansion, Eleanor presented Elizabeth with the irrefutable proof of Thomas Sterling's original sin. "He built this empire on the bodies of soldiers, Mrs. Sterling," she whispered, gesturing to the opulent room, "and he killed your son to protect it. The key to his vault, the final evidence, is the only way to ensure Arthur's sacrifice wasn't in vain." Elizabeth Sterling, tearfully confronting the devastation of her life, silently produced a small antique key. The serpent in the garden was about to be dragged into the light, and the ultimate agent of its destruction would be the woman who stood quietly beside the tycoon for decades. Eleanor now had the key. The final confrontation, the last chance to expose the corruption and fulfill Arthur's legacy, was only moments away, leading directly to the ultimate showdown in the very heart of the gilded cage. The American public was watching, waiting for the truth to shatter the silence.
The moment Eleanor Vance pocketed the antique key from Elizabeth Sterling, she felt the immense weight of 3 decades of corporate lies pressing upon her. The path was set. She had to infiltrate the fortress of Thomas Sterling to retrieve the ultimate unassailable evidence, the final details of the serpent in the garden concealed in the tycoon's private vault. The task was suicidal. Thomas Sterling, now under intense public scrutiny following the initial leak of the Watchman's call, had turned his Fifth Avenue mansion into a veritable fortress. Every window was barred, every entrance guarded by Harriman's most loyal and most brutal men. Eleanor, the erstwhile immigrant's daughter and clandestine writer, had to become a master strategist. She relied on her network of immigrant allies. Marco, the Italian socialist, used his experience in organizing to create a diversion. He organized a small, seemingly spontaneous protest near the mansion, drawing the bulk of the security detail to the front gates. Eleanor's entry point was not the front door of the gilded cage, but a ventilation shaft in the seldom-used conservatory, accessible only through a neighboring tenement building. The contrast was stark. One building representing abject poverty, the other obscene wealth. She moved through the mansion's vast, silent halls like a ghost. The air was thick with the scent of aged mahogany and suppressed anxiety. Every corner was a testament to the tycoon's bargain. Opulent paintings purchased with war profits, tapestries woven by exploited labor. She located Thomas Sterling's private study, a room designed to intimidate, with its floor-to-ceiling vault built into the marble fireplace. The key, given by Elizabeth, was a perfect fit. The vault opened with a heavy mechanical sigh, revealing not stacks of cash, but meticulously organized boxes of documents and correspondence, a paper graveyard of corporate sins. Eleanor, the maverick journalist, knew speed was essential. She ignored the financial ledgers and focused on the personal correspondence, searching for the final link, the records confirming the cover-up of the Civil War derailment, the names of the co-conspirators, and the political quid pro quo that sustained the system. She found it, a brittle, handwritten letter from Thomas Sterling to a prominent senator, not only detailing the Civil War fraud, but also explicitly confirming the orchestration of the rail bridge sabotage to pressure the current Congress into war. It was the complete, undeniable confession in black and white. Eleanor had brought the only weapon she truly trusted, a small, specialized camera capable of taking quick exposures, a gift from a reform-minded photographer she'd once interviewed. She couldn't steal all the documents. She had to photograph them. The silence of the mansion was broken only by the quiet, rhythmic click of the camera shutter as she systematically documented every incriminating page.
It was a race against the clock, a physical act of defiance against the man who had bought silence for 30 years. But the clicking was proving too loud. Harriman, having quickly dispersed the street protest, returned to the mansion and immediately noticed the study door ajar. He burst in, gun drawn, his face a mask of cold fury. "Stop, watchman," Harriman roared, recognizing the infamous figure hunched over the vault. "The tycoon wants his papers, and he wants you silenced permanently." Eleanor, her heart hammering, snapped the final photograph, a picture of Thomas Sterling's portrait hanging above the vault, with the handwritten confession pinned to its frame for scale. She slammed the heavy vault door shut. The ensuing chase was a desperate sprint through the gilded halls. Eleanor was not a fighter, but she was fast and knew the terrain of class. She knew the service stairs, the hidden corridors used by the servants, a world the masters ignored. She burst onto the main staircase, only to come face to face with Thomas Sterling himself. The tycoon, pale with fury, was blocking her path to the front door. "You insolent gutter rat! You dare step into my house? You dare destroy the empire my son died to protect?" "Arthur died for the truth, Mr. Sterling," Eleanor shouted back, standing her ground for a final, terrifying confrontation. "And his truth is about to be published in every paper in America. You didn't just build a fortune on fault lines, you built it on lies and murder." As Harriman cornered her from behind, Thomas Sterling, consumed by his paranoia, lunged at Eleanor, not to physically harm her, but to seize the camera, the only evidence of her night's work. In the struggle, Eleanor managed to trigger the camera's final flash, capturing the raw, murderous fury on Thomas Sterling's face. She then hurled the camera not to the floor, but through a priceless stained glass window depicting the American progress, signaling the end of the tycoon's control. Harriman seized her, but the noise and the spectacle of the broken window brought the police and the returning protesters to the scene. The damage was done. Eleanor was arrested, the camera and its precious roll of film gone, vanished into the night. But she had seen the truth, and she had captured it in black and white. Even under arrest, the maverick journalist had achieved her goal. The confrontation was public, dramatic, and undeniable. The full exposure of the serpent in the garden was now inevitable, setting the stage for the most sensational legal battle of the Gilded Age.
The shattering of the stained glass window at the Sterling mansion was not just the sound of glass breaking, it was the sound of the Gilded Age cracking under pressure. Eleanor Vance, the maverick journalist, was arrested, charged with breaking and entering, theft, and corporate espionage. Thomas Sterling believed he had won, replacing the truth with a sensationalized story of a criminal conspiracy against an honest industrialist. But he had fatally underestimated his opponent. The camera, thrown through the window, had been retrieved by Marco and the Immigrant Network. Within days, the photographs, the damning confession in black and white, were plastered across the front pages of every progressive and independent newspaper in the nation. The images were undeniable. The tycoon's face twisted in rage, the documents detailing the Civil War fraud, and the explicit proof of his war profiteering bargain. The ensuing legal proceedings were immediately dubbed the Trial of the Century. Thomas Sterling, utilizing his immense wealth, hired the most formidable legal team in the country, aiming to swiftly convict Eleanor and, more importantly, discredit the photographic evidence as forgeries created by a socialist agitator. Eleanor, however, found an unlikely savior in her corner, a brilliant, morally driven young lawyer named George Hawthorne, who had previously clashed with the Sterling firm. Hawthorne saw Eleanor's trial not as a defense of a criminal, but as a historic opportunity to put the entire corrupt system of the Gilded Age and Thomas Sterling himself on trial. The courtroom became the true battlefield. The prosecution framed the case as an attack on property rights and American capitalism. Hawthorne, utilizing Eleanor's notes and the network of allies from the mill strike, framed it as a defense of democracy and the sacrifice of Arthur Sterling. Hawthorne's strategy was audacious. He did not deny Eleanor broke the law.
Instead, he argued she did so under the necessity defense that a greater crime, war profiteering and political treason, necessitated a lesser crime, trespass, to prevent catastrophic national harm. His first masterstroke was calling to the stand witnesses from the mill strike, forcing Thomas Sterling to sit inches away from the very workers he had oppressed. Then he introduced the testimony of the dead. He had Eleanor testify about her secret alliance with Arthur Sterling, painting a vivid picture of the heir's internal struggle and ultimate noble sacrifice. Eleanor's voice, clear and unwavering, moved the jury and the gallery. Arthur Sterling was murdered by his own father's security chief because he could not bear the weight of his family's crimes. He gave me the truth, knowing the cost. This trial is not about me. It is about whether a man can kill his own son and sell this country to the highest bidder without consequence. The climax of the trial came when Hawthorne called Elizabeth Sterling to the stand. The tycoon's wife, frail but resolute, was a devastating witness. She confirmed Eleanor's story of the hidden vault key, and in the hushed courtroom, exposed the true nature of the serpent in the garden. My husband built his first fortune on cheap iron that cost the lives of Union soldiers during the Civil War. He covered it up, and that secret poison has fueled his greed ever since. He destroyed Arthur's soul, and then he destroyed Arthur's life. I gave Miss Vance the key because the truth must be valued more than the Sterling name. The testimony shattered the courtroom's decorum. Thomas Sterling, unable to maintain his composure, lunged towards his wife, shouting epithets and denying everything, a public outburst that corroborated every accusation of his monstrous nature. He was quickly restrained, his public image of the stoic industrialist completely ruined. The jury, composed of common citizens, a mix of small business owners, skilled laborers, and housewives, was sequestered. The nation held its breath, recognizing that their verdict would define the ethical boundaries of American capitalism. The verdict was read out. Eleanor Vance was found guilty of trespass, but not guilty of theft or corporate espionage. The complex verdict was a masterpiece of legal and moral compromise. It upheld the sanctity of property rights, the trespass charge, but simultaneously validated her cause and the photographic evidence, the not guilty charges. The moral victory was absolute. The photos and the testimonies were now officially part of the public record, immune from legal challenge. The next day, facing a warrant for the murder of Arthur Sterling and a massive federal investigation into war profiteering and fraud, Thomas Sterling disappeared. The tycoon's bargain had been exposed, and its architect had fled, collapsing the shadow of steel almost overnight. Eleanor Vance, though convicted of a minor crime and facing a small fine, walked out of the courtroom a free woman and a national hero. The trial of the century had proven that even in the most gilded of ages, justice, when pursued by a tenacious few, could still prevail and shine brightly under the spotlight, offering a final, heartbreaking redemption for the sacrificed son, Arthur Sterling.
The flight of Thomas Sterling from New York City was the final, devastating crack in the fragile facade of the Gilded Age. The trial of the century and the publication of the incriminating photographs had confirmed what many already suspected. The largest fortunes were built on sand, deceit, and systemic corruption. The revelation that sterling steel, a colossal pillar of the American economy, was founded on Civil War fraud and sustained by active war profiteering, caused an immediate and violent collapse of investor confidence. The public panic, already high due to Eleanor's revelations, was exacerbated by a pre-existing instability in the nation's gold reserves and an over-leveraged railroad sector. The dominoes began to fall with terrifying speed. Within weeks of Thomas Sterling's disappearance, the New York Stock Exchange witnessed a catastrophic collapse. The overextended railroad companies, many of which were financially entwined with Sterling Steel, went into receivership. Banks that had lent heavily to these railroads, banks once considered untouchable, began to fail. The collapse was not limited to Wall Street. It spread across the nation like wildfire. The failure of major banks and railroads meant that credit, the bloodline of industry, simply vanished.
thousands of businesses, from massive manufacturing plants to small storefronts, were unable to secure loans or pay their workers. Factories that had been the pride of the Industrial Revolution abruptly shut down. Unemployment soared, reaching levels that America had never witnessed, paralyzing cities like New York, Chicago, and Philadelphia. The very engines of the American dream sputtered and died. The most heartbreaking cost was borne by the common man. Immigrants who had poured through Ellis Island, carrying nothing but the hope of a better life, now found their jobs gone, their savings wiped out in failed banks, and their hard-won dreams turned to dust. The tenements, already crowded, now became scenes of desperation, hunger, and silent fear. The economic devastation was the ultimate bitter outcome of the tycoons' bargaining. The greed of one man and the complicity of the elite had inflicted a nationwide catastrophe. Eleanor Vance, now a celebrated figure but convicted of trespass, paid her fine and immediately dedicated herself to organizing relief efforts. She realized that while her victory in court had been moral, the economic battle was just beginning. Her fight shifted from exposing the tycoon to mitigating the impact of the crash and the cost. Working alongside her immigrant allies, Marco, Finn, who finally testified for the official investigation, and the O'Malley family, Eleanor established soup kitchens and temporary shelters. Her notoriety as the Watchman gave her a platform to appeal to the few remaining charitable figures and institutions not utterly crippled by the panic. She documented the unfolding human tragedy with the same sharp, unflinching eye she had used to expose Thomas Sterling. Her articles, now published nationally, detailed the personal toll of the Panic of 1893, the father who couldn't feed his children, the elderly who froze in the winter cold, the young woman forced into desperate circumstances. She argued that the collapse was not a natural correction, but a crime of capitalism, directly attributable to the unchecked greed she had exposed. During this period of national despair, Eleanor found unexpected closure regarding Arthur Sterling. Among the final papers Arthur had given her was a detailed schematic for a new kind of charitable trust, a foundation designed to use a portion of the Sterling wealth to fund labor reform, public education, and worker safety initiatives. Arthur had envisioned this as a counter-legacy, a way to use his inheritance to heal the nation his father had wounded. With Thomas Sterling gone and the empire in receivership, Arthur's mother, Elizabeth Sterling, quietly stepped forward. Devastated but determined to honor her son's sacrifice, Elizabeth used her remaining private assets to officially establish the Arthur Sterling Memorial Fund, basing it on the blueprint her son had created. The fund was small amidst the devastation, but it was a powerful symbol. It represented the final, moral triumph over the tycoon's corruption. Arthur's sacrifice had not only exposed the serpent, but had also planted a tiny, resilient seed of hope, a commitment to use wealth not for exploitation, but for social justice. Eleanor, now an advisor to the fund, saw Arthur's vision as the only way forward. The Gilded Age had ended in a crash, a brutal reckoning. But from the dust and ruins of broken dreams, a new idea was taking root. That the true measure of American success lay not in the height of its skyscrapers, but in the strength of its community and the safety net it provided for its most vulnerable citizens. The cost had been immense, lives ruined, a nation paralyzed, but the crash had effectively cleared the slate. The time for the unbroken thread of American resilience and true reinvention was finally at hand.
The year following the crash and the cost was one of stark, unforgiving reality. New York City, once the glittering symbol of unchecked wealth, was choked by industrial smoke and economic despair. Yet in the absence of the tyrannical power of the tycoon, a different, more profound force began to rise from the ashes, the unbreakable American spirit.
The spirit of resilience found its champions not in the halls of government, which remained slow and compromised, but in the streets, in the community centers, and within the immigrant quarters that Thomas Sterling had once dismissed as inconsequential. Eleanor Vance, guided by the moral compass that had defined her journey, became the central figure in this collective effort. The Arthur Sterling Memorial Fund, though initially modest, provided the first essential thread of relief. Its focus was immediate and practical, establishing cooperative workshops, setting up trade schools to retrain the vast numbers of unemployed factory workers, and providing microloans to immigrant families attempting to start small businesses. Eleanor worked tirelessly alongside her loyal allies. Marco, the young Italian socialist, used his organizing skills to coordinate the relief distribution across ethnic lines, transforming scattered, desperate groups into a unified community force. Finn, the former mill foreman, now headed the fund's safety audit program, ensuring that the few factories still operating complied with basic human standards. A direct, living counter-legacy to the exploitation he had suffered under Sterling Steel. This period was the true fulfillment of the Ellis Island echoes. The diverse tide of immigrants did not break the nation. They became the source of its renewal. They shared resources, protected one another from loan sharks and unscrupulous landlords, and rebuilt their small worlds with sheer tenacity. They were the living proof that the tycoon's bargain had failed, because true wealth lay in human connection, not capital. Eleanor, while focused on relief, never abandoned her role as the maverick journalist. She understood that the rebuilding of the spirit required more than soup kitchens. It required truth and transparency. She founded a new publication, the Phoenix Press, named for the bird rising from the flames. This paper was dedicated to muckraking, a new style of investigative journalism that exposed corruption not just to shock, but to catalyze specific legislative reforms. Her articles during this time shifted focus from who committed the crime to how the system allowed it. She wrote powerfully about the necessity of a central bank to stabilize the economy, a response to the bank failures of the crash, the need for federal labor laws to abolish child labor, and the critical importance of government regulation to break up monopolies. Her journalism provided the intellectual framework for the progressive movement that was soon to sweep the nation. She turned the painful ruins of the past into the blueprint for a better future. Perhaps the most symbolic moment of this rebuilding phase came with the fate of the abandoned Sterling Steel complex. Elizabeth Sterling, working with George Hawthorne, Eleanor's defense lawyer, now a rising political reformer, negotiated a complex legal settlement. The courts seized the company, but instead of selling it off to another single industrialist, risking a repeat of the tycoon's monopoly, they agreed to Arthur Sterling's original vision. The former Sterling Steel plants were broken up and sold to a consortium of smaller, regionally managed companies, with a significant portion of the assets dedicated to funding the Arthur Sterling Memorial Fund. The old textile mill where Eleanor's father had once been exploited was converted into a worker-owned cooperative. The shadow of steel, which had once loomed as a symbol of monolithic oppression, was dissolved and decentralized. It became a monument to the power of public justice and the ultimate, posthumous victory of the conflicted heir, Arthur Sterling. Eleanor's father, having his health stabilized and his spirit restored, was among the first to work in the new cooperative. Standing in the sunlit factory, his hand resting on the smooth new machinery, he looked at Eleanor. The pain of the past was still there, but so was a quiet pride. "The work is honest now, Ellie," he said, his voice husky. "We built the steel that built America, but now we build it for ourselves." In that moment, Eleanor realized that the resilience in the ruins was complete. They had not just survived the crash, they had fundamentally altered the DNA of American industry and society. The Gilded Age was over.
the era of the unbroken thread woven by the hands of the immigrants, the laborers, the journalists, and the sacrifices of the principled few, was finally ready to define the next chapter of the American story.
The year is 1910. Nearly 2 decades have passed since the thunderous collapse of the Sterling Empire, the crash and the cost, and the subsequent rise of resilience in the ruins. The era of the Gilded Cage is now a cautionary tale in history books, replaced by the fervor and foundational laws of the Progressive Era. New York City, rebuilt with sturdier steel and a more scrutinized political structure, stands as a testament to the power of democratic will. The dark, hidden machinery of the tycoon's bargain was dismantled, piece by painful piece, but the legacy of the lost, the lessons learned through sacrifice and struggle, remained. Eleanor Vance, now in her 40s, stood not on a strike line, but in the bustling newsroom of the Phoenix Press. She was no longer just the watchman or the maverick journalist. She was a widely respected national figure, an editor-in-chief whose investigative reporting had directly influenced the passage of the nation's first comprehensive child labor laws, corporate transparency acts, and federal banking reforms. Yet Eleanor never saw her work as finished. She understood that democracy was not a state of being, but a continuous, often brutal process, an unfinished work. She would often walk through the city, past the former Sterling textile mill, now proudly displaying the sign, "The Arthur Sterling Cooperative." She'd see the children of the mill workers not on the factory floor, but heading toward public schools, many funded by the Arthur Sterling Memorial Fund. The fund, now a massive national philanthropic entity run by a dedicated board that included Elizabeth Sterling and George Hawthorne, was a living monument to Arthur's principle over his father's profit. Thomas Sterling, the architect of the Serpent in the Garden, was never found. Rumors placed him anywhere from a remote South American plantation to a quiet villa in Switzerland, his vast remaining fortune guarded by offshore trusts. His physical escape was a stark reminder to Eleanor that while justice could be served, complete closure against entrenched wealth often proved elusive. The battle against corporate corruption would be a fight for every generation. One quiet afternoon, Eleanor visited the newly erected statue in Central Park. It wasn't a monument to a general or a senator, but a simple, dignified bronze marker dedicated to all those who gave their lives to reveal the truth. The plaque bore the name Arthur Sterling. Eleanor stood before the statue, the sunlight catching the soft lines around her eyes. She hadn't forgotten the fog-shrouded night of his sacrifice or the weight of the evidence he had entrusted to her. She thought of Arthur not as a tycoon's son, but as a true patriot who had ultimately chosen the rugged path of democracy over the comfort of the cage. His legacy was not in the steel he inherited, but in the laws his death helped forge. She realized that the true, enduring American spirit was born not in the easy wealth of the Gilded Age, but in the collective struggle of the lost, the immigrant families, the exploited laborers, and the brave truth-tellers like Arthur. Their sacrifice ensured that the promise of America, though constantly tested, remained alive. Eleanor turned away from the park, heading back to her newsroom. The fight was endless, the work demanding, but the pen was her sword, and the truth, in black and white, was her eternal guiding light. To all our readers who joined us on this epic journey through the Gilded Cage, America's reckless dawn, thank you. We hope you felt the grit of Eleanor Vance's fight, the moral struggle of Arthur Sterling, and the raw resilience of the immigrant tide. This story, rooted in the genuine economic turmoil and muckraking spirit of the late 19th century, reminds us that the fight for justice under the spotlight is never truly over. You saw the crash and the cost, but you also witnessed the rebuilding of the American spirit. Your engagement,
Your passion for stories of truth and sacrifice is what keeps the presses rolling. If you connected with Arthur's tragic choice, were inspired by Eleanor's courage, or felt the weight of that shattered stained glass window, please let us know. Drop a comment, like, and share this story with anyone who believes the pen is mightier than the corporate sword. The legacy of the lost is the foundation of our future. Keep reading, keep fighting, and keep demanding the truth.